Hello, and welcome to the Amongst Romans podcast, your window to everything Italy from an outsider's perspective. Join us each week as we navigate the Italian way of life and all the adventures that come along with it. So last weekend, we ended up going to the archaeological park in Pompeii, and it really made me realize that we've talked about Pompeii a few times, but we never really talked the details. So everything you need to know about visiting Pompeii. So I thought maybe this time we can actually talk about Pompeii itself and offer you some tips for visiting.
Yeah, of course, it's one of those sites everyone comes to Italy to visit at least once, right? It's up there with visiting the Colosseum in Rome and some of those sites. But Pompeii is actually quite different because of the fact that it's so well preserved, right? It's actually a pretty thriving city back in, 7th, 8th century BC. Originally, it was populated by the Greeks, and then shortly after, I believe it was the Etruscans, and then finally the Romans with the help of the Samnites when they took over. So yeah, it's a pretty significant city.
One of the things that people might not realize today is that during the Roman times, Pompeii was not just a rich city, but it was also very popular, right? So think of resort towns and places where people go and have villas and things like that. Pompeii was very much the same way. There were a lot of rich Romans who used to come from Rome, and they had villas and apartments in Pompeii because Pompeii in that time was a lot closer to the water than it is today. So a lot of the villas had seaside views and, you had the Mediterranean weather, the citrus trees, and it was a very nice place for them to live. The earth around the area is also very rich. Even today, we have produce that is very huge, I would say, because of the fertile soil. I think in those days, they were even calling the area the breadbasket of the Roman Empire, which gives you an idea of just how wealthy and established the city was before the tragedy that happened.
A lot of the villas and homes, when you walk through them, all the big ones have courtyards, and you can see fountains in the middle, statues, beautiful frescoes in each of the rooms. And obviously that required quite a bit of money to get a hold of back then, right? So there was quite a bit of wealth in Pompeii.
We should talk about what happened. Most people know that in 79 AD, there was an eruption from the nearby volcano, Vesuvius, and it covered the city. Most people think it's lava, but it's actually ash gases from the volcano that ended up killing the people who were already there. And then the ash covered the city. And that was really the reason it got preserved for so long. Now, the unique part about what happened in Pompeii is not just that it happened in Pompeii, because we also know that nearby areas also suffered the same fate. We know a lot about the eruption from the works of people who lived at that time. So one of the most influential writers was Pliny the Younger. He was a Roman author and a lawyer, and his first-hand accounts really are what gives us the understanding of exactly what happened, the sequence of events, and also gives us an idea of the signs that were happening that, people at the time did not see as ominous. He is very good in writing letters to another historian, Tacitus, and his letters have been used as a source for a long time. So they're very interesting because he talks about how the eruption happened. It wasn't something that happened just overnight. I think that's what most people seem to believe, is that one day you wake up, boom, the volcano explodes and everyone's dead. The actual process took a few days. So there were a number of signs that people chose to ignore. I mean, at the same time, they didn't know what was going to happen, right? So it's not something that they had a precedent. We know a lot of what happened, the efforts that people tried to go and rescue them, and, all that from his writings, which I think is really invaluable and gives you more of an understanding of what happened. So now if you go to Pompeii and walk through those streets, it's really quite, I don't know, it's very tangible. You feel the history, and then you walk and you see the volcano in the background. I think you can really imagine, this must have been so terrifying when it was happening.
Yeah, I believe the eruption lasted a good 2 days. I think, it started with the pumice rain coming down on the city. Some people managed to escape with some of their belongings, but many in the city did perish. Initially, they thought many perished from the ash that came down, but later on, they found out it was actually the extreme heat from the volcano that caused many of the deaths. I think the ash preserved the bodies that did perish. Unfortunately, it was the heat that caused the majority of the deaths. And I think at one point, the city population was well over 2,000 people. And I think they managed to excavate about 11 to 1,200 bodies. So a good portion of Pompeii did perish, but some did manage to make it out alive.
What I think is interesting is that it was such a big event and so many people were aware of it at the time, and yet it was forgotten. So it basically was buried for about 1,700 years, that by the time they discovered it, nobody really knew about it. Nobody knew about Pompeii, which shows you just how history can be lost over time. What I think is interesting is that what we know as Pompeii being rediscovered at 1748 is actually not the first time they found it. An early discovery was in late 16th century, around 1592, I believe. And it was an Italian architect who accidentally uncovered parts of the Pompeii site. And he was digging a canal for a river. And he came across these frescoes. So at the time, they were not fully aware of what this could have been. But I just find it fascinating that they just covered it up and just kind of acted like nothing happened. It took almost 200 years later for them to actually find it again and start excavating it. When you think of an excavation site and what we see today, this all started in 1748. That's a long time of uncovering this big city that was buried so many years ago, right? We've been there several times now. And I do think it's a site worth visiting if you're in this area, especially if you are doing this grand European tour or this grand tour of Italy. I think you should definitely put Pompeii on your list. What do you think?
Yeah, I would have to agree. It's one of those sites that you have to visit. Every time we go, we always find something new that they've uncovered or restored. A lot of amazing villas were opened up to the public after restoration, and a lot of the frescoes are intact in those specific villas that they've uncovered and restored. Granted, if you've already been, I'd still recommend going back because, like I said, there are new locations opened up to visitors.
And I think that's a good point because sometimes when you go into Pompeii, if you have never been, it's like walking into a city that everything has been removed except for the streets, the walls, and maybe the entryways. So you kind of think, what's there to see? And it can be very deceiving when you're walking by because after a while, it all starts looking the same, right? There's another courtyard, another arch, but there are a lot of villas. So think of, let's say, if you have a row of houses today, that's kind of how the villas were organized in those days. You'd walk into a villa, you have a courtyard and the rooms around it. From the outside, from the street, it might not look like much because they're hidden. They are cornered off and you might not be able to go in. Sometimes they do have villas that they open up to the public where you can actually go in and see those frescoes, see those things up close. So even though it looks from the street like, oh, there's really nothing in there or just looks like another, ruin beside it, it's actually not. If you're looking at understanding what life in ancient Rome was like, I think Pompeii is a great place to explore. Is it 100% accurate? I would say a lot of what we know about ancient Rome comes from the books and the works left over. But the site gives us a good understanding of how they lived. So you have streets, right? You can even still see the indents from the wheels from their chariots and, how the roads are organized. It's quite fascinating. Like when you walk through, it looks very much like a city today.
And you can see a lot of the advancement that the Roman Empire provided back then. The raised sidewalks, the streets. It was actually pretty interesting seeing the crosswalks where you can walk across the street and how it directs chariots, horses, carriages, or whatever back then, almost like a two-way road without the dividing lines. You actually had those raised roads where it allowed those carriages to go through. But you can also see all the interesting advancements when it came to how they had their fountains set up, all the aqueducts and such. It was a pretty interesting view into that Roman era.
One of the things I love seeing is not just the frescoes, but also the layout. As I said, you walk in and it's a city on the grid. So it's very similar to cities we're familiar with today. I think I watched a documentary a few years ago and they were talking about, they were able to even analyze which streets were one way and which streets weren't by the indents the carriages made. When they were turning, they could analyze where they were more worn out to figure out which streets were one way and which streets weren't, which again is a very modern concept of road work and transportation. So you don't have to look for that because I think that'd be a bit onerous to try to look at every corner and find those. But just when you know this, it's really quite fascinating. And as you said, like the plumbing they had baths, right? Baths were a big part of the Roman culture. So they had hot water, they had sewers, they had things that we today take for granted, but they were forgotten for many centuries after them. So again, if you're looking into seeing what life was like more than 2,000 years ago, I think Pompeii is a great place to explore.
As everyone's aware, Pompeii, the archaeological site or park, is actually part of the UNESCO World Heritage Sites due to the significance of the site itself, offering such a extraordinary glimpse into how Romans lived and the riches the city had back then. The ancient city covers an area of 660,000 square meters, which is 66 hectares. And the park itself covers 440,000 of those square meters. So, there's a large number of homes and buildings. I believe the number is up there to around 1,500 in total so far. And obviously, they're continuing to excavate. You can see when you reach the end of some of the roads where the excavation ended, you can still see portions of the buildings, houses sticking out from the ground. There is a lot to still uncover, and I'm sure they'll be doing it over the years. I know from several years back, there is a big difference of the number of buildings that we were able to see. They've increased exponentially since then. It's one of the most visited archaeological sites in Italy, next to Rome's Colosseum and other complexes there. I believe they have about 3.5 million visitors per year, and that keeps climbing.
That's insane when you think about it. Over 3 million people each year come to Pompeii. And again, because it's such a big site, you think, wow, this must have been a really big city. But as you said, there's still a good chunk of it that's not fully been excavated, right? So there's still a huge chunk that we don't know. And the excavation have been happening for 200, 250 years. And we still have so much to go. It just kind of shows you of the meticulous work that goes into excavation and getting the area ready for people to come and see. So that's why, as you said, Alex, I think it's important that if you've been to Pompeii, let's say 20 years ago or 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, you might find that there are new places to see now that were not open at that time. So I think it's always a very interesting park to visit, especially if you've been there once, you can go back and visit the places that are new, that perhaps weren't open when you were there the first time. So let's maybe touch upon the must-see spots in Pompeii, because there are quite a few. If you go on the official website, they have a map that you can map out things and the villas, and you can, I would say, use Google Maps to navigate it. It's actually quite easy. They are all on Google Maps. Find out the villas you want to see beforehand. And the website is actually quite good. It has a lot of information on the new discoveries, new things that are open. So you might want to jot them down and then mark them off. So when you enter the site, again, it's like a city. So you have to walk from place to place, which might take you a while because, like I said before, it's on a grid. So it's not like you can just cut across. There are streets, there's houses. You have to kind of make your way around. One of the most fascinating places you first enter to, it's the Forum. For me, the Forum is quite fascinating because, like any other Roman city, that was the heart of the city. But today, when you walk in there, and that's the site you probably see the most from pictures, when you kind of walk up to it, you turn left and you have a view of the volcano in the background. So you're standing in the middle of the Forum, surrounded by what used to be temples and buildings and columns. In the background, you see the volcano, which to me is very freaky. And it's just like a reminder of what happened. So many years ago, just on the left of the Forum, they used to have a storage for a lot of things they found in Pompeii. So vases, statues, even the casts. But they have been moved. So today you don't see those. They are in a different part of the park. When we were there originally many years ago, they used to be in this area as well. So you can't miss the Forum. You probably get there. It's the first thing you enter, you see it, and then you kind of expand from there.
So one of the other major sites that you want to see in Pompeii is the amphitheater. It's one of the oldest amphitheaters built in the Roman times. Obviously not as a grand scale as the one in Rome, but this one actually is slightly different. It was both built out of stone, but there is actually some wooden structures to it, and it doesn't have the underground waiting area for gladiators that would entertain the citizens of Pompeii, and it actually fit a large amount of people. It was a fairly grand size amphitheater, one of the largest. Not as large as the one in Rome, but I believe it held up to 20,000 spectators, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah, and it's one of those places where I don't think you would necessarily expect when you go to Pompeii. Like you said, it's like a mini Colosseum, and you can easily walk into it. Again, it's not as big. And next to it, they used to have, and you can still kind of go in, it's a courtyard now, but it used to be the school for the gladiators. So that's where they used to train. And I think a lot of them from even other parts of the Roman Empire would come to this particular location to train. So that's also quite fascinating. If you were into the gladiator games, that's where you went. And Pompeii also has two other amphitheaters. They're not like the fully round ones. They're more of what you would use for plays. You can go into those and walk up the steps. They still have occasional concerts there, as they do in a lot of archaeological theaters all over Italy. So again, you can visit those. I think this will give you a really good overview of the city around you because you're kind of elevated. So you can actually see in a distance and kind of see what the city looked like.
Another type of site that is actually very common in the Roman era is the Roman baths. So there was actually multiple in Pompeii, and these are grand complexes for the citizens of Pompeii. I believe there was the stadium baths, and then there was the suburban baths in Pompeii.
Yeah, I think the bathhouses are very fascinating, and you can gain a lot of information from there. And like we mentioned before, they do have the pipes, and if you go with a guide, they'll be able to explain to you better sort of like the hot water and cold water pools, which kind of are similar to what we have in a spa today. But probably one of the most visited sites in the Pompeii site itself, it's the brothel. And they have a lot of very suggestive frescoes. In the Roman times, brothels were very popular in big cities, and they were, I would say, almost like a la carte. A lot of the brothels would have pictures of services that you could partake in. Some of them were also meant to stimulate or offer suggestions, but definitely the brothel is the most common and most popular attraction in Pompeii. If you're there and looking for it, just look for the lineup of people outside and you'll be able to find it pretty easily.
The population of Pompeii definitely were well serviced when it came to sexual services, because I believe they all, outside of the brothels, they also had apartments or rooms in the various bathhouses. So that's another interesting tidbit.
Yeah, they were very free with their sexuality in those days. One of the places that we went to when we were there on the weekend is a newly opened villa. It's called Casa dei Casti Amanti. And this one was owned by merchants who were slaves, and they were freed and then became very wealthy. In this one, you can see a lot of the rooms with really well-preserved frescoes. We managed to see that. There are many houses in Pompeii with frescoes. This is newly opened. There are a couple other ones that we didn't have a chance to see on this visit, but we'll go back again to see. There's many houses all over, especially the wealthy villas where the affluent lived, where they have more frescoes that are preserved. And they're really quite fascinating because when you see them, they're very vivid. Some of them are very red. Some of them are very like black with gold and white. And I don't know, it just seems like it would be very odd to be in a place like this because they don't really have windows. All the rooms open into the courtyard and they have these deep, dark colors. I'm not sure how dark it would have been. Obviously, they would have had oil lamps to light up, but just for our taste today, I just think it'd be a bit much to be in a place like that with such deep, dark colors.
There were some interesting color palettes that they used for those frescoes to adorn the walls. I found them quite dark, but I guess they had a way to get some additional lighting into the house from the roof somehow. I thought they were a little overdone. Speaking of the rich of Pompeii, there was also some amazing mosaics on the floor. I did notice that, and they're all mostly intact, which is amazing considering the age of many of the structures. And I think also, what I was pretty surprised by was a lot of the fountains and bath areas were also intact. You can see the marble was, unfazed from the earthquake and the eruption of Vesuvius. So it was pretty interesting to see.
I think one of the things I noticed when we were there this time was that the new house that opened that we went to, they had second floor. Because before, and you can see this in Pompeii in particular, when you're walking around, you might feel that a lot of the houses were one level because you think, okay, they're villas with a courtyard, so it's mostly like one level. But they actually had multiple levels, right? Sometimes they had 2, sometimes 3. And this villa that we went into, you could see the second floor. It's a bit unusual because in Pompeii, a lot of them look like they're just one level. So this one had a bit of the second level, and you could actually get a better idea of what it must have looked like because it's not just a wall with like no ceiling. It's actually, you feel like you're in a building, someone's house, which is very different from the previous visits in Pompeii.
So when you're planning your visit to Pompeii, I would recommend checking the website specifically for new locations or sites to visit because they are doing work consistently every day. There's something that they're working on to make available to the public. So I would definitely visit the site and get some details, plan your trip out beforehand.
Now, let's talk about visiting the park, because I think a lot of people have questions on how to get there, how to get the tickets, and it can be a bit confusing. So we talked about it in the previous episode, but in case you missed that one, they've introduced several new rules for Pompeii. So if you're coming in 2025, be prepared that it might be a different experience. So what are they doing? They are limiting the number of visitors per day. So right now, the limit is 20,000. Before, they could easily have up to like double that. So imagine how many people that is every single day. It started already in November, but there'll be 20,000 visitors per day. So during the busy seasons of April to October, they're going to have 2 slots. In the morning, between 9 and 12, they'll limit 15,000 visitors. And between 12 and 5:30, another maximum of 5,000 visitors.
Yeah, I guess there's some good and bad to this decision. I know there's an issue with over-tourism in general here in Italy, and they want to preserve the structures in the park and be able to control access to certain areas. Obviously, there are people posted in various locations, but it's pretty difficult to control the number of people that are visiting during high season. So I think there is the fact that there's that preservation in mind, but it also limits tourists from being able to schedule a time to visit and make it convenient for them. So yeah, I would definitely recommend planning ahead of time, making sure that you do get tickets and book the site ahead of your visit.
Another change regarding tickets, which I'm not quite sure how that's going to work, but they're calling it nominative tickets, which basically will have your name on it. So when you're buying the ticket yourself beforehand, your name will be on the ticket. So I guess it's to prevent people from entering multiple times or trying to switch tickets. So basically, you'll have to book your ticket ahead of time, give them your name when you show up. They'll check your ticket and your ID. And that just seems like a nightmare to me because I think for them to be doing that, it's going to be a lot of work. But we'll see how that goes. If you're planning on coming with a tour, again, they might increase prices just simply because there's less options available. So obviously, it's going to be first come, first serve. That might also affect your visit. But the good thing is you don't need to have a tour when you're coming to visit Pompeii. And I think that's something that most people are not aware of. So yeah, I think we should talk about maybe the other options that you can do and how you can see Pompeii.
Yeah, most people don't know this, but there is free access to the park every first Sunday of each month. So if you are visiting Italy or in that area during that time, keep in mind you can visit the park for free, which is a bonus. And I believe this applies to many other archaeological sites within Italy, but there is that free admission, which can save you a good bit of money.
So when we went on the weekend, again, it was the first Sunday of the month. You come in, you show your ID, you get your ticket, you go inside. You don't have to pay for it. It's January, so it wasn't as busy. But actually, I was surprised that there were quite a few people still there. I don't know how you felt, but I thought it might be less busy.
Yeah, it was surprising to see the number of people still visiting, especially, in the middle of January, right? Like we said many times before, there is really no low season here in Italy. Expect to always have some number of people or crowds in major sites.
So one of the things I would say to keep in mind if you're coming on a free Sunday, again, you have to get there early because those days more people come. I don't know if that's why we felt it was busy on last weekend when we went because it was free. But again, you'll have a lot more people show up because it is free. They close admission about an hour or 2 hours before the park closes. When we were there on the weekend, I think they were closing the door at 4. So when you got there before 4, you can get in. But at 4, they closed it. And then it gives them another hour or so to get everybody out of the park. Because again, it's massive, right? You have to make sure that everybody leaves. No one is left behind. That might take some time. If you're coming during the busy season, that might be even more difficult. So I would say, again, plan ahead. Or another great option is come off season. And I think that's something that we always promote. And like we said, we went last weekend. It's January. It was beautiful. I think it was like 15 degrees. It was sunny. It wasn't too hot. It wasn't too cold. It was a perfect day to explore. And again, it wasn't overly crowded.
Yeah, I think we might have overdressed a little bit for the weather because, yeah, it was definitely pleasant. And I know we had some heavy coats on, expecting it to be a little bit cooler, but, be ready to take jackets or layers off if you do end up going in the middle of January.
You're walking around, so you're going to get warm, even more so. And a lot of it, not as much, but there is certain elevation, right? So you do have a bit of a hill here and there. You have to go up and down, not maybe as much as you do, let's say, Naples, but there is some elevation changes. And again, the ground's uneven. It might be a bit more tiring when you're walking around. But I think January was perfect. I was there in November, which was also great. I think we might go back next month because we had to leave early. We couldn't stay as long as we wanted. So we'll check it out then. But I think if you're thinking of coming to Pompeii, really off-season is the best time because between May to October is the busiest, right? So you have people, you have tour groups, you have student groups, everybody's coming to Pompeii and there are a lot of people. And if you get stuck behind a tour group, it's sometimes hard to navigate through them. That's what happened to us the last time we went. We're trying to get through and there was a big group of people and they're walking slowly and the tour guide was talking and we just wanted to get through and we couldn't because they were just blocking our way.
Now, the question is the amount of time, which is a reasonable question to be spending in Pompeii. There is a lot to see. I know there is a huge difference from when we first visited together several years ago. They've discovered a lot of new villas, new locations, new sites. I would expect to spend at least 4 to 6 hours walking around. It depends on your pace. However, if you really want to sit back and look at, a lot of the beautiful frescoes and paintings and statues, I expect to spend a little bit more time, right? Consider booking the full day, visiting this site because there is a lot to see.
Just picture like being in any city today. You have to get from one place to another. There's no bus. There's nothing to get you through. So planning ahead what you want to see might be a good way to maximize your time. I do feel that after a while, if you don't know where you're going, it will be overwhelming because all the streets kind of look the same, right? Like this ruin looks the same as this one. This looks very similar to that. That road the same as that. You get very tired and then you're lost. And then it takes you forever to leave. And by the time you leave, you're exhausted. So I would say if you're coming with a tour guide, that's a good way of maximizing your time because they will take you the key points, explain to you where you're going. If you choose to go on your own, you can plan ahead what you want to see. I said Google Maps is great because they have all the main villas there. So you can plot sort of where they are. And then you can kind of walk between, where you want to go, how you want to see. I would just say be careful because we had a little incident where it told us to actually leave the park and go around, which was not what we wanted to do. So within the park, you should be okay because it kind of tells you like where things are and how to get to. But I would say definitely half a day at least to see the main key points and get the most out of the experience.
Yeah, there's a lot of interactive maps online that you can use to plan your trip out. I highly recommend doing that beforehand, knowing where you want to go and what sites you want to see.
Now let's talk about how to get there. It might be a bit confusing. We always drive. There's parking lots around the site, which is easy. If you don't have a car or you're not coming with a car, again, a tour group is a good option. So if you're coming from, let's say, Rome, I know from Naples too, they do a lot of direct transportation / tour of the site. You can opt for that. Or you can take the train. There's a train station just outside one of the entrances, and you could just walk directly from the train station into the site. There's buses that come from Naples and other nearby towns. And again, it's fairly easy. It's a big site. It's one of the most popular ones. So there is lots of options to get there.
Now, some tips for visiting the site. Obviously, we already spoke about dressing appropriately for the weather. Obviously, I think we were, at least one of us were a little overdressed for the weather when we visited last weekend. But, definitely check the weather and dress appropriately. It's better to be safe than sorry because you don't want to be either too cold or too hot during the time period you're going. There is the option of guided tours. They vary in prices, obviously, depending on what experience you want. And then there's, the self-guided that you just plan out yourself. There's lots of online resources, apps that you can use to do that. Obviously, there's pros and cons to hiring a guide. It can be slightly expensive, but if you're in a time crunch and you want to get the maximum experience from your visits, it definitely is worth hiring a guide.
If you don't want to go with a guide and you still want a guided experience, they do have audio guides available on site, which you can buy, which again will help you explain what you're seeing and where you're going. If you don't want the whole tour experience with other people, you just want to go on your own, that's also an option. Now, let's talk about the nearby attractions. If you're coming to Pompeii, you might as well take advantage of the surrounding attractions that tie in. We always talk about Herculaneum because Herculaneum is another one of those cities that suffered the same fate as Pompeii. Herculaneum wasn't as big as Pompeii, but it's exactly the same idea. Seaside resort town, wealthy people, volcano explodes, buries it for centuries. What's different about Herculaneum is that most of the site is under the current modern city, so it's not as much to explore. It's a much smaller site. And I think it's actually a nicer one. I don't know how you feel.
Yeah, it's a great alternative, I think, to Pompeii, right? If you're in a time crunch, Herculaneum might be a better option because a lot of the spots are very much intact. I think more so than Pompeii. I found it a little bit more interesting. It looked like a smaller resort type town, but you can actually see a lot of the homes and villas are totally accessible and a little bit more, I guess, more intact in comparison to Pompeii. So it's a perfect alternative personally. And, it might be a better option for you because, I think it'll be a little bit less busy in comparison to Pompeii.
I would say if you're planning on coming to the area, doing both of them is a good idea. I just don't think it's a good idea on the same day because you'll be exhausted. Honestly, like if you go to Pompeii, it's such a big, massive site that it gets overwhelming. Herculaneum is smaller, but it's very similar. So you, I think, would just have fatigue from just so many ruins and you might not appreciate it as much. But I would say you can split. Let's say go to Pompeii one day and the next day do Herculaneum and then go to the Mount Vesuvius. So the volcano is open. It's a park and you can actually take a hiking tour to the crater. We went, I remember a number of years ago, tried to do that, but at the time it was closed because of the weather. So we haven't been able to do that. We have to go back and do it. But, that's another thing you can combine with your trip because it's really because of the volcano that Pompeii exists in the state it does today. So if you want to kind of switch it up and see where it all started, I would say do Pompeii one day and the next day do Herculaneum and Vesuvius.
Now, if you're interested in artifacts, many of the recovered artifacts actually are displayed in the Naples Archaeological Museum. If you want to bypass the long walks and the exposure to weather, you can visit in comfort and go to the museum to see those specific artifacts.
Yeah, the museum itself is also quite large. I would say allocate about 2 to 3 hours to see the whole museum to get the most out of it. So again, there's a lot to see, not just in Pompeii, but in the area that is related to what was found, and it will give you an even more immersive experience in what you can find, what you can learn from site and how people used to live there. I'm going to leave some links for you guys in the show notes so you can get more information and you can have this information ready when you're coming to Italy. We will be visiting Pompeii again probably next month because we didn't get a chance to see everything this week. So in the future, we might do another episode about Pompeii, so stay tuned. And we'll be back with another fascinating way of looking at Italy and giving you some tips for your visits.